The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was sketching commission work at my kitchen table. My coffee had gone cold, my pencil was wearing down to a nub, and then my mother's voice cracked through the receiver. "Your father has something he needs to tell you about your sister." Sister? I'd only ever had one sibling, my older brother Marcus. But as it turned out, that wasn't quite true. When I was 14, our seemingly ordinary family exploded overnight. Dad had been leading a double life, carrying on an affair with one of his co-workers that resulted in a daughter, little Sophie, barely 1 year old when the truth came tumbling out. Can you imagine the shock? One day you're complaining about typical teenage problems, and the next you're learning you have a half-sister you never knew existed. Marcus, who was 16 at the time, completely shut Dad out for an entire year. I couldn't even make eye contact with our father for months afterward. I still don't know if Mom had suspected all along or if she was just desperately clinging to the life she knew. Maybe it was because Dad had always been the primary breadwinner, providing financial stability for all of us. Whatever the reason, I watched her fight tooth and nail to keep the marriage together through endless therapy sessions, counseling appointments, and heated arguments that shook the walls of our house. You'd think after nearly destroying our family, Dad would have cut ties with the other woman completely. But that never happened. He stopped the romantic relationship with Sophie's mother, Jessica, but kept her close as a friend. Even more bizarre, Mom and Jessica developed this strange sister-wife dynamic that made my skin crawl every time I witnessed it. From that point forward, every holiday became a nightmare. Christmas, Easter, birthdays, Jessica would show up with Sophie in tow, and Marcus and I were expected to embrace this child as our sister. The woman who knowingly helped wreck our family was suddenly treated like extended family herself. I just couldn't do it. Marcus eventually came around when Sophie turned 4, deciding he'd step up as her big brother. He still refuses to speak to Dad or Jessica, but somehow became Sophie's fierce protector. Maybe I sound bitter, but I've never been able to see Jessica as anything other than a homewrecker, and Sophie? She was a living reminder of how everything had been destroyed. I know Dad was equally to blame, but as a hurt teenager, it was easier to direct my anger at them. I made it crystal clear that Sophie would never be my sister. That decision has created years of tension and awkward family gatherings where no one feels comfortable. Recently, Sophie decided she wanted to switch schools. Something went wrong at her current one. Frankly, I don't care about her high school drama. For context, in our area, high schools can specialize in different fields: culinary arts, cosmetology, performing arts, things like that, unlike the general academic high school she'd been attending. Struggling academically, Sophie dropped out and decided to try art school. She's decent at art, nothing extraordinary, but good enough to get into a well-regarded program. The school happens to be near where I live. Sophie and Jessica still live close to my parents, about 3 hours away from me, so commuting would be impossible. 2 days ago, we had another one of those uncomfortable family dinners. Jessica and Sophie were there, much to my discomfort. The conversation eventually turned to Sophie's living arrangements for school. I could tell they were dancing around the real question, hoping I'd volunteer before they had to ask outright. When I didn't take the bait, they finally came out with it. Would I let Sophie live with me during the school year, Monday through Friday, with weekends back home with Jessica? They even pitched it as beneficial to her because I work in illustration. Suddenly my unstable art career was the perfect environment for their precious daughter. Let me explain why I said no, loud and clear. First, there are perfectly adequate dorms near the campus. Not luxury accommodations, but suitable for a high school student. Second, I don't like Sophie. I've always been honest about our lack of relationship, and shared genetics won't magically change that. Third, Marcus lives closer to the art school, about an hour away. He's at least on good terms with her. Fourth, when I once asked Jessica for help during a difficult period in my life, she laughed in my face and told me we weren't family. But now suddenly we're family when it's convenient for her. Fifth, my apartment is small, and though I have a second bedroom, it's occupied by my best friend who pays rent. I'm not evicting my best friend for anyone. Sixth, they didn't ask, they demanded. When I hesitated, they swarmed me like vultures. Sophie has anxiety, dorm living would traumatize her, I'm her only real sister, God wants us to be a family, I'm an atheist, by the way, Marcus's girlfriend is pregnant and can't handle strangers, so Sophie can't stay there, and I should just kick out my roommate because family comes first. The audacity was breathtaking. I could tell they expected me to resist politely for a while before giving in. But when the conversation turned into shouting and guilt-tripping, I abandoned all pretense and simply said, no. Sophie ran out crying, everyone fell into icy silence, and I was told to leave. Someone muttered that I should go back to kindergarten since I wasn't acting like an adult. Jessica later sent me a message that I left on read. Dad tried calling, but I didn't answer. I refuse to be bullied and manipulated into something that makes me deeply uncomfortable. I know it's not Sophie's fault she was born into this mess, but she's not my family, and I don't owe her a place in my life, much less my home. Update 1. When I got home, I found Sophie sobbing on my couch, completely falling apart. My roommate quickly filled me in on what had happened. Sophie had shown up expecting to see me and was shocked to find my roommate there instead. She immediately asked if my roommate was visiting or leaving soon, and when my roomie calmly explained she lived there, Sophie launched into a one-sided argument that escalated until she had what my roommate called a panic attack. As soon as Sophie saw me, her breakdown shifted direction. She started screaming, calling me a horrible sister, a liar, a leech, and hurling other insults my way. The horrible sister part 1 understood, but liar and leech stung. I kept my patience and eventually calmed her down enough for us to talk without broadcasting our family drama to the entire building. That's when the truth emerged. Turns out, Jessica and Dad had been using the possibility of Sophie living with me as leverage for at least 6 months. Ever since she decided to leave her previous school, they'd been dangling it over her head: get good grades or you won't get to live with your sister. Clean your room or hand over your phone. Drop those friends or delete social media. The prospect of living with me had become their carrot for months. I felt terrible when I realized this. I didn't doubt her story for a second. It was classic dad behavior, promising something big and letting us tear ourselves apart hoping for maybe delivery. Apparently, Jessica had told Sophie I'd agreed to a trial week and that afterward she'd go back home for the rest of summer to prepare for the actual move. I had absolutely no idea they'd promised her this, especially since I'd been clear from the start that I was against the idea. Looking back, maybe they figured if Sophie showed up at my door, I'd cave since I'd stepped back so many times before to keep the peace. Maybe having her physically in my home would make it impossible to say no, and they'd steamroll me again to avoid crushing her dreams. The whole situation was awful, but for the first time ever, Sophie and I actually talked, really talked. 40% was us complaining about Dad, 40% was venting about Jessica, and the rest was discussing art. Oddly enough, I found some silver lining in that mess. I'm not saying I'm ready to be the doting big sister or take her in, but there was genuine connection beneath all the pain. Eventually she fell asleep on my bed before her parents arrived to pick her up. I waited there, emotionally drained. Dad finally showed up around 11 p.m., furious that Sophie had fallen asleep and incredulous that I hadn't just let her spend the night. But I was angrier. After hearing Sophie's story, I was dying to hear his side. I unleashed a 5-minute rant so fast I could barely breathe, and by the time he managed to respond, I doubt he remembered half of what I said. All he told me was that he'd call later to discuss it properly. Now I'm waiting for that call, feeling emptier than ever. I'm so emotionally drained I could barely function at work today. I ended up staying at a friend's place last night, nothing romantic, just the comfort of platonic closeness we've shared since childhood. I know I have a lot to sort out, and I've started making a list of everything I need to address when I find the energy. Right now I'm just hoping for clarity and peace, if I can ever find them. Update 2. I apologize for my silence. Life has been such a whirlwind that finding time or energy to update felt impossible, but I have to share what's happened. I really appreciated all the advice and support, even though this update probably won't satisfy anyone hoping for a happy ending. Not long after everything exploded, Sophie showed up at my door again, as if the universe was playing a cruel joke. I didn't waste a second. I called Dad and told him to pick her up immediately or I was calling the police. He came, insisting he'd explain everything, but predictably it took serious cornering before he revealed anything substantial. What I learned was as wild as I expected. Jessica was in dire financial straits. Part of me wanted to blame it on her being too young when she had Sophie, but honestly, Jessica's entire sense of responsibility is stunted. Maybe there's trauma in her past, maybe not. I don't care anymore because whatever happened, Sophie's paying the price. Jessica had accumulated massive debt, taking out too many loans with no realistic repayment plan. Now she's essentially losing everything in debt consolidation. Even her salary is being garnished, leaving her with barely enough to survive. To make ends meet, she decided to sell her apartment and move into something so small it made me physically cringe when I saw it. She wanted to move in with Dad permanently, but thankfully Mom had set strict boundaries. Jessica and Sophie weren't allowed at the house for longer than a week, special occasions only. Jessica's plan was to buy this glorified studio apartment and squeeze herself and Sophie into that tiny space, while dropping hints that maybe someone else would step in to help. Against my better judgment, I let Sophie stay with me temporarily. It was a disaster. Living with her was impossible. I never realized how troubled she truly was because I'd never been engaged with her long enough to see it. She suffered from severe night terrors that left my roommate, a light sleeper who works a physically demanding job, exhausted every day. Sophie was also allergic to cleaning, and she stole my watch. After that, I called Dad and told him to solve it because I wasn't putting up with it anymore. Dad practically begged me to let her stay, promising she'd improve. But even if that were true, I wasn't about to suffer through the process. I set a boundary. I'd only consider taking Sophie if she went to therapy. But Jessica doesn't believe in therapy. I figured Dad would finally step up and take Sophie in, but Mom was adamant. She absolutely refused. That led to a huge fight, and Mom ended up having a panic attack that landed her in the hospital. That was the final straw. Sophie was sent back to Jessica. Jessica was furious, at me, not at her own decisions. According to her, I'm the only person who could offer them a real home, but I'm too hateful to make space. If I'm honest, part of me is angry, furious at being put in this position. Then Marcus got involved, berating me for not stepping up even though he owns a house. But he has a newborn baby, so that supposedly absolves him of any responsibility while dumping it all on me. He had the nerve to say, blood is thicker than water, when I mentioned my roommate lives with me, as though my chosen family doesn't count. Now everything feels like it's in limbo. Dad keeps trying to wear Mom down, and when he's not arguing with her, he's making passive-aggressive comments to me. Jessica bombards me with guilt-laden messages, and Marcus doesn't bother hiding his contempt anymore. I'm seriously considering cutting everyone off completely. It's crushing to watch my whole family turn against me. At least I have my roommate. She's probably the only good thing to come out of this ordeal. I still feel terrible that I put her through exhaustion and let Dad manipulate me, but I'm endlessly grateful she's still with me. Update 3. I thought things couldn't get worse. I was wrong. Last Tuesday, my roommate came home looking like she'd seen a ghost. She'd been getting anonymous calls, always when I wasn't around, hanging up when she answered, but she could hear background noise, TV, kids playing. Creepy enough that she'd started letting calls go to voicemail. Then 3 days ago, Jessica showed up at her workplace. My roommate works at a veterinary clinic, and Jessica walked in claiming she needed to discuss urgent family matters about me. She cornered my friend during lunch break and launched into an unhinged rant about how I was poisoning everyone against Sophie, how I was selfish and heartless, and how my roommate was enabling my cruelty by living with me instead of making space for real family. My roommate told Jessica exactly where she could shove her opinions and threatened to call security. But Jessica wasn't done. She actually offered my friend money, 2 months' rent, to move out temporarily so Sophie could have the room. When my roommate refused, Jessica's mask completely slipped. She started screaming about how my friend was a leech living off me, how she was probably sleeping with me anyway, and how no real friend would stand in the way of family. Security had to escort Jessica out, but not before she shouted loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear that my friend was a homewrecker keeping sisters apart. When I confronted Dad about Jessica's behavior, expecting him to be horrified, he actually tried to defend her. She's desperate, he said. You have to understand she's losing everything. When I pointed out that harassment and workplace stalking aren't acceptable regardless of someone's situation, he suggested that maybe if I'd helped family from the beginning, none of this would have happened. That's when something clicked. I asked him point blank if he knew about Jessica's plan to harass my friend. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he admitted Jessica had mentioned she might try to reason with my roommate directly. He didn't stop her. He knew she was planning to ambush my friend at work and did nothing. I was so angry I could barely speak, but then he dropped another bombshell. Mom has been having what he calls episodes since the hospital incident. She's been obsessing over the whole situation, staying up all night researching Sophie's school, even calling the admissions office pretending to be Sophie's guardian to ask about housing options. Dad seems genuinely worried about Mom's mental state, but instead of getting her proper help, he's been trying to solve the problem by pressuring me harder. If you just agree to let her stay for the school year, he said, your mother could finally have peace. We could all move past this. The manipulation was so blatant it actually made me laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that surprised even me. I told him Mom's mental health wasn't my responsibility to fix by sacrificing my own peace and safety. Safety, he yelled. She's a 17-year-old girl, not a criminal. Your own sister. Half-sister, I corrected, and not by choice. He hung up on me. 2 days later, Marcus showed up unannounced. He looked exhausted, the baby's been keeping him up, and his girlfriend Emma has been struggling with postpartum depression. I felt a flicker of sympathy until he started talking. Dad had called him with a new solution. Since Marcus's house has more space and he's supposedly on better terms with Sophie, maybe she should live there instead. But Emma absolutely refused. She's struggling enough without adding a troubled teenager with night terrors and behavioral issues. So naturally, Marcus decided this was all my fault. The entitlement was breathtaking. When I reminded him I'd already tried living with Sophie and it had been a disaster, he suggested maybe I hadn't tried hard enough, hadn't been patient or understanding or sisterly enough. I told him if he was so concerned about family obligations, he could move his pregnant girlfriend and newborn in with our parents, freeing up his house for Sophie and Jessica. The horror on his face was priceless. That's completely different, he sputtered. I have a family to think about. So do I replied. My chosen family. My friend who's been with me through everything, while you all demand I throw her out for someone who stole from me. He left after telling me I was selfish and would regret pushing everyone away. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am selfish. But I'm tired of being the family scapegoat, the one everyone expects to sacrifice her happiness for the sake of keeping peace. My friend and I have started looking at apartments in a different part of the city, somewhere my family doesn't know about. I haven't told them yet, but I think I'm done with all of it. With all of them. The saddest part is I genuinely feel bad for Sophie. None of this is really her fault. She's just a kid caught in adult dysfunction. But I can't save her without destroying myself, and I'm finally accepting that it's not my job to try. Update 4. I never thought I'd be writing another update, but life has a sick sense of humor. The apartment hunting didn't go as planned, finding a decent place in our budget that accepts pets, my friend has a cat I forgot to mention, is harder than expected. But that's the least of our problems now. 3 weeks ago, my friend came home looking like she'd seen a ghost. She'd run into Emma at the grocery store, and what should have been polite small talk turned into Emma breaking down in the cereal aisle. Between sobs, Emma told my friend everything. Marcus has been putting massive pressure on her to reconsider taking Sophie in, coming home every day with new arguments about Sophie's grade suffering, her depression, the terrible conditions she's living in with Jessica. But Emma's barely keeping her head above water with the baby and postpartum depression. The idea of adding a volatile teenager was sending her into panic attacks. Here's where it gets twisted. Marcus had been telling Emma that I'd basically agreed to take Sophie but was just being difficult about logistics. He made it sound like I was playing games while a child suffered. Emma felt guilty about refusing when she thought I was already willing to help. My friend set the record straight immediately, telling Emma about the theft, night terrors, Jessica's workplace harassment, all of it. Emma went pale and asked why no one had told her any of this. That's when my friend realized Marcus had been lying to everyone, spinning different versions to manipulate each person. But it gets worse. Emma said something that made my blood run cold. I just wish I understood why he's so desperate to help her now when he completely ignored her for years. When my friend asked what she meant, Emma explained that Marcus had been having private phone calls, always stepping outside or going to the garage. She'd assumed it was work until she overheard part of a conversation. I know, but I can't keep doing this forever, and she doesn't suspect anything, but the guilt is killing me. Emma confronted him that night. He broke down and confessed he'd been sending money to Jessica, not just recently, but for years. Right after Sophie was born, Jessica had contacted him claiming she was struggling financially and that Dad wasn't providing enough support. Marcus, feeling guilty about rejecting Sophie initially, started sending monthly payments, small amounts at first, then more as Jessica's demands increased. Jessica had told him Dad didn't know about the payments and it needed to stay secret because Dad was already doing so much. She painted herself as a struggling single mother too proud to ask Dad for more help. Marcus ate it up because it made him feel like he was being a good brother without actually having to have a relationship with Sophie. Emma discovered through bank statements that Marcus had sent Jessica over $15,000 in 3 years, money that should have gone toward their house, wedding, and preparing for the baby. Emma was livid, but Marcus begged her not to say anything because he was trying to fix it. That's why he'd been so desperate to get Sophie living somewhere else. Jessica had been threatening to tell Dad about the money if payments stopped, claiming she'd expose Marcus as a hypocrite who'd been secretly supporting his daughter while publicly rejecting her. My friend came home with this information, and I honestly didn't know what to do with it. I felt vindicated. I knew something was off about Marcus's sudden change of heart, but mostly I felt sick. The entire family had been lying and manipulating each other for years. I called Emma directly. She was hesitant at first, but everything poured out. She's considering leaving Marcus, not just over the money, but the lies, manipulation, and the way he'd been making her feel guilty for protecting her mental health. She said she felt like she didn't know who she'd married anymore. I told Emma she deserved better and none of this was her fault. I also offered my couch if she ever needed a place to stay while figuring things out, not for Sophie, not for Marcus, but for her and the baby if they needed an escape. She started crying, saying she'd been feeling so isolated, like everyone was against her for not taking Sophie in. Finding out the truth about Marcus's motives made her feel less crazy but more hurt. Strangely, she asked if I thought she should tell Dad about the money. I said that was her decision, but that Dad probably already knew. Call it intuition, but this whole situation reeks of secrets within secrets. 2 days later, Dad showed up at my door, but this time he looked defeated rather than angry. He sat heavily on my couch and said, "We need to talk about your brother." Turns out I was right. Dad had known about the payments for months, discovering them when Marcus accidentally sent a payment confirmation to Dad's similar email address. Dad confronted Jessica, who broke down and admitted she'd been manipulating Marcus for years. But here's the part that made me want to scream. Dad had been letting it continue because it meant less pressure on him to support Jessica and Sophie. He was essentially letting Marcus subsidize his mistake while positioning himself as the good guy trying to bring the family together. The web of lies is so deep I'm getting dizzy. Dad using Marcus's guilt to avoid responsibility. Marcus using manipulation to force me into solving his blackmail problem. Jessica exploiting everyone's guilt to fund her lifestyle. Mom having breakdowns because she senses the lies even if she doesn't know details. And me, apparently the villain for being honest about not wanting any part of this mess. Dad asked if I'd consider taking Sophie now that I knew the full truth. I laughed and told him that learning about more layers of lies and manipulation didn't make me more eager to get involved. That's when he dropped the final bombshell. He and Mom are considering divorce. Mom found out about him knowing about the payments and feels betrayed all over again. She's been staying at her sister's house for the past week. So now Marcus's marriage is falling apart, my parents are headed for divorce, Jessica is panicking about her money source drying up, and Sophie is still stuck in the middle of adult dysfunction. And somehow I'm still the bad guy for wanting to stay out of it. I don't even know what to feel anymore. Part of me wants to tell everyone to figure it out themselves and block their numbers, but another part, probably trained by years of family guilt, wonders if I should try to help somehow. My friend thinks I should stay far away from all of them. She's probably right, but it's hard to watch your entire family implode, even when you know they brought it on themselves.